script. A kind of wobbly transcription, the air brushes along my lips. The trees murmur like deceased aunts spilling cups of tea in their ginger laps. Lips, laps, the lush insistence of you time, pushing against everything we do. You are a shivering, unflinching closeness, a tune we all have stuck in our heads as we lift blue towels from the washing machine, drag our minds through the news, tally the dead, frail as daffodils, trailing their stubborn pollen along our outstretched arms. I wake with a quaking inside me, a to-do list of vitamin pills, the precise wording of half-written emails, conversations intricate as medieval tapestries, glistening with their multitude of tiny threads. I write to you, dear time, minister of fear and sex and the hope of the body, to grab at the visible tremor of a tree's fog-laced leaves, to note the street lamp in a Magritte urban square, the oncoming darkness momentarily stalled before that quiet glow. I want to stuff my mind with all the living I can. Mortality be damned. Let's relish another tablespoon of that tarragon seasoned lobster sauce against the sheer glass of a Houston skyline. A delicate terror builds within me. Oh, Sheila, you're on mute.
And I'm unmuted. I was trying to mute myself so I didn't interfere with your beautiful poem. I love that poem, and it does something many of your poems do, which I'm interested in. It is kind of cinematic in the way it moves through experience. And also, in some ways, one thing I'm always struck by is in your poems, the images become a kind of argument. You know, the kind of ways things are described. Like I'm looking at this passage where we go, I write to you, dear time, minister of fear and sex and the hope of a body. And then we get the visible tremor of a tree's fig-laced leaves. And there's so much kind of lushness to the image and the surface that even when your poems are talking about quite serious, melancholy, or difficult things, there's always this exuberance in the image that adds another layer, which is something I admire and find really interesting in your work. And there's also a kind of theatricality, which what I want you to talk about. We have a lot of poems in this book where we're conscious of arrangement or the power of arrangement. For example, in the wonderfully titled, If I Were the Writer of My Own Spy Thriller, which is a poem I want to come back to because it's very witty and funny in many cases. Alexandra, your opening line is, there would be snow in at least 7 scenes. And then you get more specific, blue-edged snow scalloping the Swiss chalet. So we have the writer in some sense, or many of the voices in these poems, almost like you're a frustrated film director. You're moving the world around. So I think I have a 2-part question. One, can you talk about all the film references here? Because they really add a lot, and maybe start there. And then I guess I'm really interested in that arranging process, which is what artists do, and what role that's something I find interesting, that it exists in so many of your poems, that almost like the director impulse or the painter impulse. I'm going to arrange the objects here for you, and I'm going to tell you I'm doing it. So cinema, how does it feel?
No, it's a great question, a great 2-part question. I guess, just to give a little background, I think I've always been a visual person. Visual things just get really, they stay with me, right? They leave a residue inside me. And my husband and I, just a little backstory, we lived in Spain for 6 years, and we really got introduced to European film, like Louis Buñuel, obviously Jean-Luc Godard. We had great friends, like our wonderful friend Ugo, who knew a lot more about film than at least I did. And our wonderful friend Liam, who's on the Zoom tonight. We just saw great film. So when William and I came back to New York, and we're pretty homesick for Europe, I think we actually kept ourselves kind of comforted by continuing to watch a lot of European film, and then just all kinds of film in general. So I see film as kind of like a world running alongside my lived experience, where I can dip into it almost like a running brook, get fed by it, and have it sort of just offer me other ways of making sense of the world, like I think like all great art does. So a lot of times when I'm writing about film, there's actually quite a lot of film poems in my previous book called Kiss Hierarchy, by Rain Mountain Press, a wonderful small press out of New York City. I'm not like writing about the plot of the poem. I'm not going, this happened in scene one. That I'm writing about the feel and atmosphere and residue that film left with me. And so, and a lot of times films are not sequential. They can leap around in imagery. So I just think I get really fed by that world, and it's obviously quote unquote bled into my poetry. Like the first opening poem of the book, The Sound Engineer with His Castanets and Feathered Pillows.
Can I just say that's the best title? I
Yeah,
love
yeah.
that title so much. Yeah, go ahead.
It's from the wonderful movie by Wim Wenders called The Lisbon Story. And this is and Wim Wenders, if you don't know him, check him out. He did An American Friend. I mean, he has a long lineup of great films, but he loved America, but and did films in America. But Lisbon Story obviously takes place in Lisbon. He was actually paid by the Lisbon tourist association to make this film. But Wim Wenders was great at creating a film around a very ordinary kind of quotidian situation an artist might find themselves in. So Lisbon Story is the sound engineer who arrives in Lisbon because his friend who he hasn't seen for years has said, hey, I'm making this great film, I need you to work on it. But then he arrives to this apartment where his friend is staying at, and his friend's not there. So he's like, what the heck do I do? So he's kind of kicking around Lisbon, but some of the scenes are him with his sound engineer equipment capturing the sounds of Lisbon. And I don't know a lot about sound engineers, everyone, but it's an interesting, profession. It's like what they do to make the sounds, they use so I feel like moments like that I love, where the creativity behind the filmmaking process is also a part of the film story. So that becomes kind of feeds the first poem. And then, if I could write, my own spy thriller, obviously comes out of William and I, my husband and I watching a lot of spy thrillers, and me going, hey, I want to do my own version. You know what I mean? So I kind of flip it around a little bit. So I hope that wasn't too long a response, Sheila.
No, that was a wonderful response. I think one of the things, I love that image of the brook going along your life, because that was sort of how it struck me to some degree. And this arranging is sort of a little bit for me an argument about imagination, almost like in a Wallace Stevens way, that, we have these things happening in our lives, but we do have this power, even when we're powerless, to aestheticize, to arrange.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that the fact that you foregrounded that was really interesting, because it adds a layer to the poems that is also in front of us. Like, it's not buried. We start thinking about the aestheticism. I just want to read a tiny bit from the spy thriller that gives you a real flavor. Because another thing I think one of the things I'm liking in these poems a great deal is the way you often move from almost comic, from beautiful detail to witty statements to really poignant ones. And I think this little run from a spy thriller illustrates it. No death-defying showdowns unless they take place in a city with well-funded art museums and free admission for the public on Sundays. And the review that Visha wrote of your book, she says, and it's written as a letter to you, so it's sort of sweet. The movie you describe flirts between fantasy and reality, flipping the violent tropes of a typical spy thriller into explorations of personal desire and reckoning. You describe a spy who pulls muscles while scaling walls, who second guesses herself, and who actually bleeds when shot. The terrible, jarring bullet interrogating her heart each time. And Visha says, it is this final line that sends chills down my own fallible body. And I wanted to quote that because the other thing I wanted to talk about is there's this sort of interesting contrast, several contrasts in your work. One is this lush surface of beautiful sensual details that often ride above, kind of like your Brooke image, a certain sort of serious or at least more weighty and melancholic preoccupations, like with time and also with the fallible body. And I wanted to kind of have you talk about some of the ideas of the body in your work. But before we talk about it, because I want everyone to get to hear your lovely poems, Alexandra, can you read Elegy to My Uterus with a Glass of Pinot Noir? Because I think that's a poem that combines many of this, the sort of imaginative Hollywoody landscapes, the beautiful kind of fun, sensual details. I mean, I always want to make something delicious after I read your poem.
That's great.
But and then the body. So I thought this
sure, no, and just to comment for a second, like your arrangement of objects or the arranging of poems, I do think I find a deep comfort in the ability to have the page as a space I can arrange things on. Life does not feel very in control a lot of the time. And I think there is, so you probably see me kind of reveling in that a bit, and trying to have a dark sense of humor about things maybe I can't control, and then loving the house that a poem is, that I can build out in different ways, and bringing in things I love or things that have moved me into that house. And I always think the writing process is at its best when I'm surprised about what ends up in that house. So, and just to get to this poem, yeah, Elegy to My Uterus with a Glass of Pinot Noir, I was kind of like, how do I write about a hysterectomy without being like, hey, everyone, I had a hysterectomy? Like, and it was a mixture of things. It was actually, in the end, a relief I did it. But of course, no one wants an operation. So I think it's why, I decided to mix some of this. The movies bring in images that allow me to come up with ways to write about things that are difficult in life. And I think the movies saved me a little bit in this poem because it wasn't an easy topic to write about. So I could write at it, Emily Dickinson style, like from a slant. And that way I could write a poem on this. I couldn't do it too directly, although there's directness in the poem. But it's called Elegy to My Uterus with a Glass of Pinot Noir. When they told me you had to go, I envisioned myself on a train in a 1950s European war film, staring out at a country I'd never see again. Its sulking borders, its brooding trees, set against the pale magentas of an irretrievable evening. Thick thud of an organ, swollen thumbprint pressed against colon, bladder, and the dangling geography of the abdomen. I'd never used you as other women had, and now, before I could claim you as something I'd loved, I was mourning you, like any female lead who knows her luck is down, her escape plans dwindling. A romance without an ounce of Pinot Noir poured, without the department store colognes of a first kiss. That's what you were to me. A story plotless, a failed poem, a smeared love letter tucked into a faulty, forgotten drawer. You dwelled uneasy in my pleated darkness and were so hard to see, your scars translucent, a shush of secrets on any ultrasound film, the x-rays blurred rain on a windowsill. But when they snipped the ligaments, preserving the almond eye of one ovary, when they sliced that slow smile across my pelvis, the anesthesiologist like a bartender, his perfectly timed margarita easing down my veins. I was lightened, untethered. You were, after all, the dense, straining plum, the widened, sad-eyed fig I'd held on to for too long, waiting in all your nodding patience for me to let go.
Oh, that's a pretty terrific poem. I think this poem is a really interesting one for our audience to look at because it is one where the sort of physical part, the language moves quite sort of almost jarringly at certain points from this real sort of medical kind of very bodily factual statement to this endless sort of imagination. And one of the things this poem for me kind of negotiates is the sort of intellectual associative history we all have in our lives, as well as like our body's history, which is something kind of a little bit mute to us. And it goes back and forth between those two things. You wanted, the question I had is, so a lot of the fragility and frangibility and also transformations of the body seem to be an ongoing theme here. Is there anything you kind of want to say about that, or something that you discovered in writing those poems?
Yeah, no, I do have several poems in this book about the body. One is a poem called A Poem About the Body. I think I'm in my mid-50s. I'm not alone in this, of course, but the body is a strange thing. I mean, we live with it our whole lives. We don't know half the things happening in it any time of day. We learn to have, it can tell us things that are quite alarming at times and then saves us other times. And it's our life companion, right? So I think I do tend to write about the surreal aspects of life. And when I say surreal, and I hope I don't overuse that word, I just mean the really strange things about it. I was a twin. I'm going to go into this because I think is one reason why I'm like this. I'm a twin, but was born in 1965. They didn't have ultrasound then. And I was a surprise. I was the second of two twins. My lovely brother came out 2 minutes before me. And I think ever since that, let's just say it was imprinted at birth, I'm kind of stunned I'm on planet Earth, everyone. Okay. So I think that's like some of my poetry comes from that. Like the whole, like, the whole equation of what it is to be alive, I'm kind of puzzling out. And so the body's part of that. I mean, and the body is a weird thing. I mean, it's also an amazing thing. Nothing like the pandemic to make you realize, I don't know, just like, I don't know about you, but I was nerding out more than ever, reading about antibodies and everything. Like there's a whole system in our body ready to fight like any kind of like
we have no
danger.
idea.
T cells, B cells, you name it, And so I think I'm drawn to exploring what is potentially not totally explorable. I mean, I'll never fully know my body, but I think I was kind of deciding to take that more head on, like this thing called the body in my mid-50s. So there's several poems about it.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to just read a little bit of that review again, because I thought she nailed this really well. And this idea of astonishment, and it's kind of serendipitous because you mentioned it. Visha says, if our bodies may ache, if our world may shut down, if our politicians may fail, to which I say, tell me about it. Why not focus on the small ways we can assert agency over our lives? I might disagree that those are small ways. I kind of think, for me personally, the imagination is an immense way. I was surprised how much of in your work, when I reread it this time, had that idea of imagination in a kind of Wallace Stevens way. Like it's the supreme thing that we can bring to the party in a way. But Visha does say this. She says, you end the poem, she's talking about a poem called It's Been a Long Day, another great title, by considering what would happen if we abandoned our shopping lists and moved through grocery stores by our wits, happening upon the foods that bring us joy, astounded at our sheer luck. And then she says this, and that's what I'm most starved for these days, astonishment at our luck, or just astonishment at the planet. And I know that, I had one more poem I wanted you to read, because I think that another sort of theme through this book, and why I'm hoping everyone here tonight will run out and buy Ricochet Script from Next Page Fest, is that even though it's not overtly a pandemic book, there's definitely this COVID feeling running through it in interesting ways. And one poem that really I want everyone to kind of sit and listen to, and then we can sort of close by talking about some of these pandemic things I see running through, is another poem with a title. I love your titles, but this one's pretty good. I've seen white hydrangeas as large as a human head. And Alexandra, I know you said you never read this one, but I was really struck by this one reading it this time, because I think in some ways I'm thinking about the pandemic poems in here and what you're saying or what is happening. Okay.
No, thanks. And this is actually always makes me think of Stony Brook, New York. And huge shout out to Sandy and Richie Feinberg. It's so great to see you here tonight. Great friends of ours, William and mine in Stony Brook, because there was really nice summers in Stony Brook and it would have some beautiful hydrangeas. So that's where I confronted these huge hydrangeas that sort of inspired this title. And it's interesting because I've not thought of this as a pandemic poem. So that's so interesting you do, Sheila. So it's I'm just kind of cogitating on that. I've seen white hydrangeas as large as a human head. At his bidding, Chagall turned people in embraces upside down. His night stars could appear almost anywhere, blossoming in floorboards or chairs. If I could create a night sky equal to his, an infinity of purple sequins, the vivid hunger of the stars, there I said it again, stars, I think I would die content. Or do I lie? Do stars know anything of fatigue? Do they subsist on more than their aloof science and package tours of the universe? The neighbor's black and white cat doesn't trouble himself with such questions. He knows when to collapse into his paws and succumb to being a mere speck of the universe, a mini furred ottoman lying on a porch in July. I've seen white hydrangeas as large as a human head, a drugged wig bobbing on a slender twig. A thought larger than I'll ever guess escaped when I held one in my hands. The day is steadfast, keeps trying to let me in, white butterfly like a lazy door key, opening and closing something in the air. I'll never hold a firefly cage in my hands, one carved by a courtesan in another century in Japan. What delicate screens those cages were fashioned with, what intricate claws to keep the light trapped. I've been crying more lately, spasms rising and falling in my chest. I see this as a kind of private progress, as if I'd grown a new sky inside, one more patient, less judging, one more willing to carry an uneasy light.
I love that poem. You know, you're right. It isn't an overt pandemic poem, and it probably isn't even meant to be a pandemic poem entirely. But in the context of this book, where there are some that are more overtly pandemic poems, I guess I read it that way because of the way it describes vulnerability and precarity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a very lovely thing in your work that kind of in many ways was reminiscent for me of Virginia Woolf, because she has a similar interest in filigree or the beautiful details of the world, but that also in certain ways intensifies the feeling of vulnerability. Sometimes there's so much, there's so little. But I guess my question is, and I read it in some ways as somewhat a pandemic, because at the end, it feels like it's on the cusp of a change. I've been crying more lately. I see this as a kind of private progress. I felt like one of the things I saw through the book was, you know, how do we use our imagination to be present? How do we continue to be astonished? How do we live through this in these small kind of moments of kind of heroic assembly, if you want to call it that. But I didn't think that COVID was an underlying theme that you were sort of coping with. So my question is very simple, and I know it's our last one. Looking at that clock, because I know David, I should call him Blake tonight. Blake wants us not to overdo our time. I'm curious, what did you did write COVID's a theme here, and how did the pandemic change your work, or what you thought you were writing about? Did it change what you thought you were writing about? What, it came into your work, and then what were you thinking about? What were kind of things you noticed?
Sure, no, it's a great question. And actually reading this, Sheila, I do see how this hydrangea poem does have pandemic aspects to it. You're actually kind of opening my eyes to that. So how is this a COVID book? One, and Laura Van Proyen can laugh out loud about this, who's my wonderful editor at Next Page Press. Check it out, everyone, nextpagepress.com or .org. Just Google Next Page Press. But she was a wonderful editor of the whole book as a whole. And as you may know, us poets are great at like diving into each individual poem. And then when you have to put a manuscript together, at least for me, it's not so easy to figure out how to do it. Well, she read the first version of it and she's like, Alexandra, I did a diagnostic and you have 40 references. You have 40 uses of the word bird. She's like, not even names of birds, just the generic noun bird. And I think, of course, I worked on editing it, so it wasn't quite the case. It wasn't meant to be a poetry book on birds, but I think that's a COVID fallout. I think yeah, you know what I mean? I think I, like everyone, was getting really familiar with my very urban, but my backyard in San Antonio, the trees. I got comfort out of birds. I was like, they don't have COVID. They're just flying around like everything's fine. You know, they don't. And I also fell in love with birds. I did a wonderful residency at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts a while ago now in 2011. And it was in the Blue Mountains of Virginia, and there was amazing birds there. And so I think some of it was a growing interest in birds, but then the pandemic, like they just were part of my company, looking out my window. And then I think birds are pretty fascinating. So that was one fallout. The other one is, as my husband put it, it's not like you see me traveling on an exotic train in Hungary in this book. Like I don't have the kind of, because I did travel a lot once in my life. I need to do some more. I haven't done some in a while, but I couldn't do that very much during the last 2 years. So that didn't show up in the book. It is a domestic book in some ways where, while and this is what film also does, it takes me out of my world. I do like ekphrastic poetry. And if you don't know that term, it's just a Greek term for when artists or writers like to write about other pieces of artwork. And I think, like, I love writing about paintings, and some of my earlier books have poems on paintings, because to me, it's just getting out of my world and bringing in other worlds. And so my window became a bit of it was my movie screen, everyone. Like I'm looking out the window in my study and this and that. And there was a lot of imagery was coming from that. And of course, just being in San Antonio. But, and then I think I do have a poem called Poem Logic, which is more overtly about COVID and just the surrealness of being in a world where it's blooming flowers on your street corner, but like you're reading the news and like, 20 people have died of a pandemic, like the weird collision of beauty next to tragedy and how that can happen. Like 9/11 happened on a beautiful day, everyone. So I just feel like I was that shows up in some of the poems as well. These how do you make sense of something that is very much present, very much affecting people, but it's not seeping into every single aspect of your life every moment of the day, you know? And so so in some ways, I think that is coming out in some of the poems too. Does that make any sense, Sheila?
It totally does. And in some, it seems.
Time out. Sorry to interrupt. Please ask your questions in the chat. We have about 20 more minutes. So if you have burning questions and desires, please put them in the chat so I can direct them to Alexandra. Sorry for interrupting.
No, thanks. That's cool. Thanks, David. Yeah, that's the audience Q&A, everyone. You can ask me questions for the last 15 minutes.
Please do ask us questions. And and please do get the book. I think we gave enough of a sampling. Thanks for all the reading you did, Alexandra, that you can see why these are exciting poems. I was just going to say that I think in some ways,
finish your last question, Sheila. Yeah.
It's not a question, it's more a comment that in some ways the interiority that COVID imposed in certain ways intensified what I think have always been themes in your work, because I've read in the past about that sort of domestic, settled, beautiful life and these big disruptive things underneath it. That's a really very human tension. I also admire very much Alexandra's work because I think she does a very fabulous job of dealing with something the great critic Charles Altieri called the craft versus sincerity dilemma in modern American poetry, which is that we want to be speaking very much from the heart. And I love that reviewer wrote a letter to you, Alexandra, because she said, you feel so sincere. You feel like my friend. These are such sincere poems. And Altieri's point was sometimes when we try to be too narrative and plain spoken, but we do it beautifully, we don't really sound like someone just speaking from their heart. And his solution he proposed was like the Jory Graham solution, like in times of great emotion, the beauty of your language collapses. I feel like what your technique is more that you're really include very much front and present the sort of intellectual interests of the speaker, and that your voice has many layers, and it works because you're able to refer to film, and you're able to create a kind of cognitive dissonance between I'm in my kitchen looking out the window and I'm on a train in Hungary through this film or book I've read. We're getting some questions. So Liam wrote to everyone, I was especially blown away by many of the endings in this book. Often one lonely line at the end, often creating an interesting turn that hints at the lack of resolution in life. Do you see that as part of the evolution of your writing? Great question, Liam.
Well, first of all, Liam is a brilliant writer himself, everyone, living in New York City. And a wonderful friend who I'm so psyched to see tonight. Liam, can you unmute yourself for 1 second and give me one example of one of those lonely lines?
Shoot, I mean, you have me on.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Poem, you know, even the first poem, Alexandra,
Okay.
the rain warped wisteria thin at the end. It's sort of like, you know, August sunset, and I'll begin to envision a supposed heaven replete with the flimsy armature. God, this stuff is good. Of the angels' wings and their violins, and then you've got that dash, rain warped wisteria thin. That's a perfect example. I see it through a lot in the whole poem, and not always just one line, but I see a very unexpected ending that, as part of a poem, finishes the poem perfectly and beautifully, but as part of a commentary in which you're writing, seems to suggest, oh crap, we haven't been able to understand 1/billionth of life and how it works. And that I just found that really interesting. And I sort of felt that this is something that you're doing more and more now, and I just want you to comment on that.
Sure. No, it's great having you ask that question. I don't see myself as a great writer of endings. They can be kind of hard for me in my poems. But I do think, obviously, as you start getting world weary in life, you're like, okay, I can't have that type of ending where everything wraps up with a nice little bow, because first of all, it doesn't sound very real, and second of all, it's not super interesting. But Sheila actually did help me with a few of my poems, Liam, where I didn't know how to end them, by having me toy around with the order of some of my stanzas.
Oh.
And I played around with that, and sometimes it didn't work, and other times it was, as I've told Sheila, kind of revelatory. Like I was like, oh, that is the ending. And but with this opening poem, you know, the sound engineer with his castanets and feathered pillows, that was actually the original ending. I think part of this was inspired by the wonderful poet Karen Volkman. I've been reading her book Crash, which is a beautiful poetry book, and I think her use of language kind of inspired me to be more playful and end on an image like that. And everyone, if you haven't read the poem, I'm looking for a sane plot in life, not finding one. And I'm being very like not super hopeful about possible heavens out there. And I'm describing angels in an unusual way, that they have violins and rain warped wisteria thin wings. So I think part of that was me being inspired by Karen Volkman and her way of like writing kind of unsettling images of things. And at this point, I thought heaven was potentially an unsettling place because things weren't feeling super settled. So I think, but thanks for saying that. Yeah, but yeah, it definitely doesn't end on like everything's gonna be okay, everyone kind of a tone. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think not only is it not necessarily a happy ending, but I mean, I think that it's almost as if you're expecting a certain type of resolution, and your resolution is almost a lack of resolution, but it works perfectly poetically. That's what just blows me away.
I
That
think
means a lot.
that's nice.
Yeah.
I think it's that you're still it's often ending at the point of heightened emotion. So there's not just an unresolved resolution. There's a certain feeling of, oh, there's a lot of feeling here, and you're dropped off it with an image or a moment. And that's pretty exciting because I think a lot, Alexandra, for me in your work, and there's another question I'm going to read, really hinges on the astonishment factor, the fact that your images, your descriptions, your textures of the things you imagine and see is always making a counter argument to everything, like a river kind of does or something, in ways that are kind of wonderful, because that is sort of the human experience. Your emotions are complicated by things that contradict them at points, you know what I mean? If we were one way, we'd be a lot less interesting. Bethany wrote a nice one. She said, just received the book yesterday. Thank you, Bethany, and have been slowly savoring it. More to read. I see how you are a visual person. Your poems play like a movie while I read. How do your poems come to you? Do they just grab you when you write? Do you play with an idea or visual and then work the words? That's a great question, Bethany.
Great question, Bethany.
And I didn't ask anything about process or revision, so I
Oh,
want to
yeah.
thank Bethany for that.
And the great question, Liam, just to close that out, I'm going to think about that more, about the endings of my poems. You've just gotten me thinking about that. Process. Okay. I usually begin with a line that comes to me. And, obviously Richard Hugo has this wonderful thing, the triggering town. And so it kind of gets you writing. Sometimes it's the sound of a word combination. I really want to write a poem. It's probably already been done. And my husband's going to laugh when he hears that, of all the autocorrect mistakes that come up in my texts, because I find them kind of, one, they're super frustrating, obviously, sometimes when I'm in a rush trying to communicate with someone, but they're kind of interesting. Okay. So I think word combinations that seem to bang off of each other, or a line coming to mind, I'll want to write it down. And usually I'll sit at the computer and I'll use that line to just start, footsteps in the snow, right? Just kind of start. And I've learned to play more in the writing process. I've learned to let the sounds of words guide me in my imagery making. So, and to trust the logic the poem's going to create, which is never a logic that I know ahead of time. So I think a lot of times, and I'll read a lot of poems, if I'm feeling a bit like dead in the water and like I don't feel very inspired, I'll just quiet. I think it's who said that? Is it Gene Winterson? If you can't write, just shut up and start reading. Who said that? I do get inspired by reading poetry. I just love all the different worlds poets create. They always it's a bit of my prayer. It's my version of spirituality. I'll read poems to take me out of my everyday and help me get different perspectives on things. And I love the physicality of words. So I think if I'm feeling a bit dead in the water in terms of writing, I'll read some poems and then I'll see what is kind of how I'm thinking or feeling after that. And I won't necessarily write a poem right away, but it'll get me in the mode to start playing with language to create a little world on the page, or maybe not such a little world. But a lot of times it'll begin with a line from something I heard in life, something I've read, an image in a film. Sometimes it's a mood and I just want to write through that mood. I am a bit of a mood poet where I want to get down a feeling I have on the page. And I do play, I am very visual. I think images often inspire the beginning of a poem, you know what I mean? But it won't be anything I've worked out very much ahead of time. I've learned over time I can write half a poem, survive that experience, come back the next day and try to finish it. I've learned I can write a poem, think it's horrible, and then come back 2 days later and be like, oh, there's something here. So I've learned definitely to trust the process more, and that if I just keep coming back to the table, the poem will tell me what it needs. And then sometimes poems are like, they fail, or I don't know if they fail, they're just they can only do
Yeah.
so much, and you have to kind of learn from that and move on and use it in a follow-up poem. But I hope that makes some sense. But I'm
Yeah.
definitely triggered by words and images, and I love your cat, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, he's always going to join us. So.
Yeah, yeah.
Aw.
That's a
Big
very,
Texas
what's his
Reed cat.
name?
Yes.
What's the cat's name?
Well, it's Sylvester.
Oh,
Oh,
that's
perfect.
Aw.
He's
You
great.
That
know,
looks like a Sylvester.
That's he's
Yeah, he really does.
Yeah, he's the big Texas Reed, and he's been zoomed all over the world now.
He's our mascot.
Yes, yes.
our
yes.
Sylvester.
Alexandra, I'm just loving the poems. Thank
Oh,
you for
that means so
sharing
much,
with
Bethany.
us. Really
Yeah.
enjoying
May I
it.
ask a question?
Yeah, no, David, ask away.
I've known you now for a couple of years. I have not read your extensive oeuvre, but I bought your book. I have it. It's somewhere. I really want you to sign it for me. But I'm really curious. As a San Antonioan native and as a transplant, I'd love to, like, does San Antonio influence your poems at all? And is it negative or positive? In a positive or negative way, or both, or what? I'd love to hear. Just talk about Texas and your
Oh, Texas. for
as
the
a
big
as a
Texas Reed.
transplant and
Great
I think it
question.
totally influences my poetry. I really love San Antonio. I think I came here kind of blind. William was hired by UTSA, and he was like, I think you'll like this city. So I was like, okay. And my husband and I lived in several different cities by the time we moved here. So we kind of knew what it was like to move to a new place, even though you don't know how it's going to turn out when you do, obviously. But it totally comes up. I remember the first time I used agave in a poem, the agave plant. I have a poem called Plot in the book that I think definitely has some San Antonio imagery in it. There's one poem which actually I might read right now if you don't mind, because
Yeah.
it's not long, but it's a bit of a sad poem. It's called Broken Homage, but I bring it up because I think it's one of the first poems I wrote in San Antonio. And I moved here when I was just about to turn 50. And I found out like a month afterwards that actually one of my beloved friends, Jelaine Robnold, had unexpectedly died. Okay, and Sheila knows about this. She fell in her garage and like hit her head, and it was kind of a weird death. Like the homicide team was brought in and like her husband was interviewed. It was a little, and I found out on Facebook, like one of my friends who knew her said, "Rip Jelaine," and I was like, what? Because it was one of those friendships where she had made such an impression on me, but I didn't see her for a few years. And so I ended up writing this poem, and it was very much, believe it or not, when I first moved to San Antonio, I had vertigo after getting here for 2 weeks. I think I was hit by cedar fever and it was kind of throwing me off. So you'll see an image in this poem where I'm kind of talking about like my kitchen spinning a little bit, and that subsided, thank God. But I bring up this poem because it was me first trying to write about this new place I was in, San Antonio. And so I'll just quickly read it. It's not long. But to answer your question, it very much feeds into my work. The urban landscapes, the new vegetation, the feeling of South Texas, which is almost subtropical. You know, we're only 3 hours from Mexico. And I think something that really floored me when I first moved here was all the flora. I'm from the East Coast and it's like February and I'm like, what the heck are all these flowers doing blooming? Like it threw me off. Like all my seasonal indicators were totally lost the first year because it's February and there's all these flowers blooming, you know, and it's not like that on the East Coast. You know, things go to sleep because of the cold. So things like that show up in my work. And I do find it a rich landscape to write about. And of course, the people here are great. But this is called Broken Homage for Jelaine. These mornings, the train winds at the borders of this city, nudging and insisting, and I step once again into the unsteady open palm of my yellow kitchen. But I didn't expect this, the news of a friend falling and hitting her head, almost carelessly in her garage or basement. The torn shards of the story already conflicting and scattering, helpless among us who are living. I think of that head its delicate skull fat with a glossy moss of black hair, and how I once loved to watch her smoke a cigarette. She slowed time down, unlatched a foggy window in the air with each distracted exhale. I try to think of that head again as a bowl full of wet blue orchids or overripe pears, and the damp gardens of an Eastern European city she once lived in, the old ladies muttering on their benches. You see, I begin my homage and then it falters and stumbles under my efforts. All I have is the stone bird bath in my apartment's backyard, its dry mouth open to the sky, and my sad asking hands wanting to hold so much and getting instead the weightless bouquet of my ongoing breath.
Nice ending.
Wow.
So I felt like, that's the first, I was in the same apartment, and actually it doesn't have that stone bird bath anymore. But the landscape of this kind of, San Antonio is interesting because it's urban, but you have residential comfort within the urbanity, with the urban landscape. Like there is a little backyard William and I have with a big live oak, and I was able to watch some of these things while writing this poem. It's not all concrete here, but there's definitely enough of it. So I think the flora, the subtropical landscape, and then obviously other things definitely are finding their way into my poems as I kind of absorb where I am in South Texas.
Awesome. Shall we, does anyone else have a question, or shall we wrap it up? I liked ending on Texas, and I liked ending on that poem, actually.
Yeah,
that's a
poem's
great
beautiful.
poem.
That's a lovely poem.
It's beautiful.
Thanks. Yeah, Jelaine deserves it. It's the least thing I could do for her, right?
Yeah, that's a beautiful poem, Alexandra.
And I love that San Antonio features in your work. I think it's kind of great. Because, I have a very complicated relationship to my hometown, which I really don't like. So it's really interesting to hear other people write about it, like Mari Soul in her novel. It's like, wow, people really find San Antonio interesting. Why?
Well, I think because it's not my hometown. And I also think where I encountered San Antonio in my life, like my life journey, so to speak, is it was a good time for me to come here. I think if I'd come earlier, it might not have been a right fit, but and my husband's from Texas, so obviously we're closer to his family here, but I love that it's an urban city with a lot of culture, but you still have, it's not in New York City where it takes you 3 hours to get to the airport. Love New York as I do, Liam. It has a laid back way of being able to live within a city that I really like.
Yeah. That's
and then
true.
Great coffee shops, great writers.
It's true. I mean, it's really gotten, it's almost, I bet it will exceed Austin as far as culture goes eventually. So, anyway, thank you guys.
Yeah, this was fun.
For showing up. This was awesome. We love having Sheila and Alexandra. Congrats on your book again.
Wonderful.
Very, very impressive. People, please buy it. I added a link to a survey if you would kindly fill it out. I have no idea where it goes. I guess it goes to Gemini Inc. I think. Yes, Alexandra's nodding. If you could fill it out, I don't know how, it's probably like a 3-minute survey, I imagine.
Yeah, very brief. It's a Google form, just like 3 minutes, no more.
Yeah. And your information will not be shared. It's just for them to know your social security number and your bank accounts.
That's pretty funny, David.
Yeah, David, that was pretty good.
That's good.
I like how you snuck that in there.
Easy donating.
Easy donating.
Yes, we're really happy to have everyone here. If you please go to Gemini Inc. and click, you can actually click at the top of the chat window to see who is coming up in the Big Texas Read. We're going to have Sheila next year, I think, sometime, right?
Oh, we have, if you don't mind me blurting out, we have Lorian Guerrero in August, which we're really psyched about. She's a prior Texas Poet Laureate, was a San Antonio Poet Laureate, wonderful writer. So Lorian Guerrero is the August feature.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That'll
Yeah,
be
so
great.
she'll
We
be
have
great.
Daniel Pena coming up sometime in October, I think. We have the author of Hausfrau, who's in Austin. She's coming up in October, actually. Anyway, thank you guys for coming. Please come
Great.
again in August. Bernie,
Bernie,
amazing to see you as always.
so great to see you.
Yeah, no, thanks so
Bethany.
much, Liam. It was so much fun seeing
Yeah, it
you.
was so great to see all these
Sue,
people.
thank you for coming
Laura,
again. We love.
everyone.
Great to see you
Sue,
too,
yeah,
Alex.
Lisa Sellers, it's great to see you. This
Thank
is the
you, guys.
amazing thing about Zoom, everyone. We kind of hang out in one room.
I know, it's crazy. We love it. We love it. We love it.
Yeah, thanks, Sheila, for the great questions. Wonderful questions. I love them.
Thank
Yeah.
you. It was super fun. Had a great time.
We love you. Yeah, you two don't go anywhere. Everyone else,
All right.
Bernie, what do you have in there, Bernie? Is that agave?
Yeah.
Yes, actually it is. And fuck off.
Yeah, she's in New Mexico.
Yeah, why not?
Why not?
Mhm.
Oh,
And
your
she
house
made it
is so
herself.
cute, Bernie.
Oh
I
yeah,
know.
I
you're-
haven't gotten to visit you yet, but it's so
you have to
cute.
come. I have a spare bedroom, so come
I
on.
know, I'm dying to come. It looks adorable.
It only takes 10 hours to drive here.
I know. I
Yeah.
could do it. I could do
Road
it. I
trip,
gotta
Bernie,
come.
road
I'm
trip.
coming.
I know,
Sheila,
I know.
I totally want a road
We
trip. to
totally
Silver
should go do it. Oh, I'm
Yeah.
dying to see you.
Otherwise, I'll come to you, and then
Yeah, I'll give you a call. I'll come. I'll come.
do. David, it's lovely to see you again too.
Same, always.
I'll see you in
You
your
look-
chair in Ireland.
Yes, what is that? I don't understand. What is the chair? Is that a hammock?
Oh,
What are we talking? What
Do
are
you
we
not
talking
remember
about?
when I first got my apartment? When I first moved.
Oh,
to
the
Scotland?
chair. Yes, yes, yes. Of course.
David asked
the
if he could use
chair.
my house when I wasn't there, but I had no furniture. I had a kitchen table, but I had no chair, so he had to buy a chair.
That's
Right,
hilarious.
kitchen table.
God.
Did I buy the chair? I must have bought the yeah, I guess I must have bought the chair. Yeah,
Yeah.
but no, I want to go. I still want to go to your house in Ireland now. Is it in Dublin? Where is it again?
No, it's
No.
not. It's actually about an hour and a quarter outside Dublin. It's in the country. It's in
But it's still
Carlow.
part of the EU, right?
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Then I could go there.
Yes.
I can go there.
Yes,
But
you
someone's
can.
renting it, I'm sure. So
I know someone's renting it. Yeah, but when I go
Gotta
home,
kick the-
probably in about a year. Yeah,
you're leaving the United States?
in about a year, I think. Yeah.
Really, Bernie?
Why?
Oh,
Oh,
this
Yeah.
is news.
I don't
Bernie.
even need to ask why. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Because you think Trump is going to be elected? Is that why?
Not because I think he's going to be elected, whether he's elected or not. I'm pretty disgusted. I love America. I love my friends here and everything. And there's loads I love about it. So I will always come
But we're
back.
fucked, man. We're
But-
fucked.
It's a little scary right now, I think. Maybe it'll change. Maybe I'm being
No,
pessimistic.
it won't.
But,
It's going to get worse.
But I just sort of, when Roe v. Wade was overturned and when I saw the
Yeah.
potential attack on gay rights, I thought, anyway. So
Here we
Yeah,
are in
fuck this
interesting
place.
times, everyone.
I'll be back.
We
They're
are
hard
in
times.
times.
I agree,
Yeah.
Bernie. Scary.
I would always be back. I love the good part of America, the grassroots, the ordinary people, the liberals.
I'm gonna get in my car and drive my 10 hours to go see you.
Yeah, we do have to see you in Silver City, Bernie. But
Yeah.
thanks everyone for joining us. This was really special. It means a lot to have been featured. And I just loved this conversation with you, Sheila.
Oh,
So-
thank you. It was really fun. I had a great
Yeah.
time.
Yes, it was fabulous. Thank you,
I
Alexandra.
love you
You
too.
know I
I'll
had
call
my
you,
booth.
Bernie.
I got it with you at AWP.
Oh, I guess
so-
I could stop.
Yeah, no, and
Oh,
I'll
not
call
that
you,
one.
Bernie, this weekend to catch up.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
call you,
please.
Bernie.